I want to make 3 points on this. First of all, the Asia-Pacific has always been an American lake. At its height in the post-World War II era, the U.S. presence was a transnational garrison state spanning 7 countries and political entities in the Western Pacific and Australia. Second point I want to make on this is, nevertheless, the pivot to Asia has intensified the already intense militarization of the Asia-Pacific. I think some of these items you discussed last night. And I would attribute this to a couple of things. The first is the redeployment of troops within Okinawa, and from Okinawa to Guam and Australia. This has been creating a lot of instability and resentment among local peoples. The second is the intensified joint military exercises, continued U.S. participation in campaign against radical Islamists, and increased logistical use of the former U.S. base at Subic in the Philippines. Third, the support of the building of South Korean military base in Jeju Island, which may become a U.S. missile defense site. And fourth, the transfer of about 60% of U.S. naval strength to the Western Pacific. Third point I would like to make on the Pacific pivot is that it's meant to contain the rise of China. More broadly, it represents a retreat from the comprehensive global military dominance that the neoconservative faction of the U.S. ruling class attempted under Bush. It really is a feint, a maneuver to serve as a cover for a limited retreat from America's disastrous intervention in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. The pivot is an attempt by Washington to retreat to an area for imperial power projection that it sees as more manageable than a Middle East that is running out of control. Third, the U.S. has taken advantage of China's unfortunate threatening moves in the Western Pacific to justify its military presence. The most blatant of these moves is China's 9-line declaration, saying that the whole South China Sea or West Philippine Sea belongs to it, despite the fact that 4 other countries border this body of water and are within their 200-mile exclusive economic zone. Multilateral negotiations to settle the issue is the obvious way to settle it, but China has rejected this approach in favor of a unilateral assertion of authority. Basically, China is saying that this international body of water that is 3,500,000 square miles, or 1,400,000 square miles large, that apparently holds massive oil and gas reserves and through which transits 1/3 of the world's shipping, is an inland or domestic waterway like Lake Michigan in the United States. To enforce its claims, China's surveillance ships have banned hundreds of Filipino fishermen from Scarborough Shoal, a rich fishing area just 137 kilometers from the Philippines and 700 kilometers from China, and harassed Vietnamese ships exploring for oil within their exclusive economic zone. So this is the 9-line. As you can see, China is basically saying to us, you're limited to your 12-mile territorial limit. Okay, the rest we control. Okay, silly. Okay, and everybody, international lawyers say that this is absurd. Where is China coming from? 2 theories. First theory, China is insecure. China's increasingly aggressive rhetoric stems less from expansionist intent than from the insecurities brought about by high-speed growth through economic crisis. Long dependent for its legitimacy on delivering economic growth, domestic troubles related to the global financial crisis have left the Communist Party leadership groping for a new ideological justification, which it has found in nationalism. The second theory is that China's moves reflect the cold calculation of a confidently rising power. It aims to stake a monopoly over the fishing and energy resources of the West Philippine Sea in its bid to become a regional hegemon. But whatever the theory or the source, China's moves have alarmed its neighbors and are forcing them into the hands of the United States by allowing the latter to portray itself as a military savior or balancer. Okay. Fourth, the third source of destabilization is Japan. Right-wing elements in Japan, including the current Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, have taken advantage of China's moves in the West Philippine Sea and Japan's dispute with China over the deserted Senkaku Islands to push for the abolition of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which prohibits war as an instrument of foreign policy and prevents Japan from having an army. The aim is to have a foreign and military policy more independent from the United States, with some advocating the development of nuclear weaponry. The country has not carried out the national soul-searching that in Germany embodied responsibility for the atrocities of Nazi Germany in the national consciousness. This failure to institutionalize and internalize war guilt, because Japan was indeed guilty of tremendous atrocities in that war, is what allows such right-wing elements as the mayor of Osaka, Tori Hashimoto, right there, to brazenly say that the estimated 200,000 Korean, Chinese, and Filipino comfort women or sex slaves were, quote, necessary, unquote, for the morale of Japanese troops during the Second World War. As he told the press, quote, anyone can understand that the system of comfort women was necessary to provide respite for a group of high-strung, rough and tumble crowd of men braving their lives under a storm of bullets, unquote, Hashimoto. Although the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and other political figures quickly distanced themselves from Hashimoto's remarks, Hashimoto was simply putting words into what many Japanese elite believed to be true. That's Prime Minister Abe right there. He advocates dropping Article 9. He's on a jet plane. Unfortunately, the number 731 was also the number of the special unit of Japanese forces in Manchuria during the Second World War that conducted experiments on human beings, for biological warfare. So, as you can see, I don't know why he decided to be in airplane 731. Okay. So, what is the solution to this? I do not think it's balance of power politics or using one power against the other. Balance of power politics like that which took place before the First World War ends up encouraging arms races and superpower conflicts that may bring conflict nearer. Once superpower dynamics takes over, the territorial issues tend to get marginalized, so it's self-defeating. Among the key points of an alternative approach are, one, promotion of the demilitarization of the Western Pacific, starting with the shutdown of US bases. Pushing states to resort to diplomatic solutions and multilateral fora to solve territorial disputes instead of resorting to force, like the Philippine government has done in bringing up its dispute with China for adjudication with the United Nations International Tribunal on the Law of the Seas, which China has refused to be party to. And C, forceful citizen diplomacy. The perspective we are coming from is that Washington's military withdrawal from Asia is long overdue. Instead of normalizing relations between China and its neighbors, the US presence has long prevented the emergence of mature post-Cold War relations among them. Left to themselves, China's neighbors will be forced to cooperate to come up with ways of dealing with the challenge posed by China. One must not forget, moreover, that China's foreign policy is the product of over 2 centuries of Western intervention, a history that is shared by other countries in the region. In short, one must not underestimate the capacity of China and its neighbors to work out a new regional order that does a better job of promoting peace, harmony, and respect for sovereignty than the current regime of US military hegemony. Let me end by focus on the potential of citizen diplomacy for peace and neutrality. I would like to use as an example the recent moves I and other Filipino legislators and civil society activists recently made in response to the Spratly conflict, where we applied the lessons of nonviolent militant action that we learned in our past as activists here in the Bay Area. On the one hand, against the warnings of China and against the advice of the Philippine government, I brought together a group of legislators, chartered civilian aircraft that we paid for with people's private donations, and flew to the islands in the Spratlys that belong to the Philippines to assert Philippine sovereignty over them and to appeal to China to arrive at a peaceful diplomatic solution. This is statements that we made while we were in the Spratlys. A bit of an exaggeration there, but you know, hyperbole doesn't harm anybody. Okay. So that was us there with a number of people in the Philippine municipality of Kalayaan in the Spratlys within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. Okay. The symbolism of the militant but nonviolent action on the international stage was that though our country was small and weak, we would not allow ourselves to be bullied into submission. David would not be intimidated by Goliath. The Chinese ambassador protested our visit to our Department of Foreign Affairs, but our Department of Foreign Affairs told him, "Your Excellency, we have something called the separation of powers, and we can't tell our members of Congress what they can or cannot do. Sometimes it pays to have been a colony of the United States." Okay. A short time later, Beijing replaced its ambassador. On the other hand, against the policy of the Philippine government, we co-authored a joint resolution in the Philippine Congress seeking the abrogation of the U.S.-Philippine Visiting Forces Agreement that allows the deployment of U.S. forces in the Philippines. The message we meant to convey was that we were not taking sides in a superpower conflict. We were not asking the Terminator for his help to terminate Goliath. This time, it was the President of the Philippines who got upset. But we reminded him, "Your Excellency, remember, we have separation of powers." Okay. Recently, we have joined the citizens in Korea, China, Japan, and the United States, an international campaign to condemn Mayor Hashimoto's horrible remarks on the necessity for sex slaves and pressuring the mayor of San Francisco, Mr. Lee, to withdraw an invitation to visit the city on June 11. The message was that we would not allow the Japanese elite to use current tensions in the Pacific to rearm and to revise history. As you can see, trans-border action can have positive effects. What this slide does not say is that hundreds of letters and phone calls from all over the world flooded the mayor of San Francisco's office, and apparently the mayor's office gave Hashimoto an honorable way out by saying it was he who canceled the visit so that he would not have to commit harakiri. Now, this may seem to be a small victory, but it shows the potential of this mode of action. To counter the state-driven trends towards conflict, trans-border citizen diplomacy, utilizing what James Scott calls the weapons of the weak, is a method that we must increasingly use and explore in the search for peace in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you very much.